Hi, this is CJ with CompRCC.com. Let's start with this piece. This goes furthest into the frame. Since they don't have directions, there is a lot of hardware to kind of fiddle through and see what you're going to need. Now, the shock towers also mount here. And that's interesting that notice how there are two holes on this side, but only one here. And they don't provide any bolts. So I'm either going to have to come up with my own bolt to go on the opposite side for the forward attachment point for this shock mount, or I may trim a piece of the old plastic bracket and just put it in there like a blind nut. But I'm going to start by putting this in. And for these, I am looking for countersunk screws. This, I assume, 2mm. Another advantage of this kit is how sturdy it makes the frame. This solid aluminum piece is better than all of those plastic pieces put together as far as making the frame rigid. Now I need to solve this little problem here. If I have one. Okay, that is the right thread size. So just to sturdy this up a little more. You know what? I may be jumping the gun on this. Just a second. See, this is where directions would really come in handy. Because I think that bolt, yep. Okay, so this anchor point is the end point on this bracket here. One thing to make sure that you do first, though, is to put on the servo mounting brackets. Otherwise, once this is in place, you won't be able to reach this screw. The only thing I would have liked to have seen differently about this kit is a replacement for these plastic servo mounts. The fact that they only screw on with one bolt each, and I did that in the wrong hole. I just see this as a weak spot in the overall design of the Dingo itself, and of all of these servo mounts. The servo attaches with 2 bolts, so that's 4 bolts to hold the servo, but it's held to the mounting plate, or in this case to this bracket, with 2 screws, one at either end. That seems like a point of failure, and the whole point of putting a high torque servo is for this thing to really be able to wrench those front wheels around. If the servo tears off, if the servo can break free, doesn't that become a problem? And what do you do about that then? Now this hole is slotted to accommodate different widths of servos, and that also means that I need a round head screw for this. They do not provide any self-tapping hardware here, so I'm going to go into the leftovers from the kit, and that looks like it's probably in the ballpark. Looks like it might be a little long. Yeah, it'll just thread through though. So let me see if there is a smaller one, and if not, I'm going to go ahead and push this through. See, this is why saving and keeping all the hardware where you can get to it when you're building these kits is worthwhile, because you never know when you're going to come back around and need to change something or add something. I might want to put a few spacers in here. Really can't do that at this time. You know, without the rest of the suspension in there, I'm really not going to be able to see what's going on or what problems arise. Obviously the servo is not mounted, I was just holding it there. The control arm is going to have to be removed and be pointing straight forward. Revisit that front bumper. It is not going to be a problem. The front bumper bracket is going to go right in place like that. Again, I may need to trim the connecting rods for the front bumper, because depending on how far this goes in, as you can see, that might actually impede against the servo, and so it depends on tolerances there. But even though this is aluminum, that would not be hard to deal with. I could just get out the Dremel and a cutting wheel and buzz right through that. I'm going to go ahead and put this on now. There's no reason not to. Now, since I have a lot of extra leftover hardware at this point, I went ahead and used a slightly longer button head screw than came out of this hole. If you can see, let me try and turn this. Okay, the screw is just protruding here, so that means it's fully threaded through the plastic, and there's the maximum amount of thread to screw contact, which makes this mount here, it is anchored better than it was before with the shorter screws that were originally slated for this position. But you know, due to all these changes, I have extra hardware. The longer screw means that this bumper is going to be a little stronger, so if I ever reach down and pick up the car by the front bumper, I stand less of a chance of bending it or even snapping that little piece off. Next step, to go ahead, mount up the bracket to the axle. I set aside the original screws that held the little 3-link bracket on. You can see those are a little longer, and these are a normal threaded screw, and they are the right screw size. They will thread right in, so I could use these. They may have provided some of these that are a little bit shorter so that there is no bolt protruding. And if you can see, this is on the longer screw is the standard screw that came with the kit. The slightly shorter one is the one that came with the Panhard. Now again, you can see the depth of the hole that this screws into versus this. So I'm going to start with these. I'm going to set the stock ones aside, and these should screw into here and not protrude 1/8 of an inch out. It wouldn't be a problem that they protruded. It's an aesthetic issue. And I am not using Loctite at this time. I may be disassembling this shortly and making adjustments and tinkering. So right now I am building it up and seeing where I'm at. Okay, and now I need a stock self-tapping button head. Okay, I have my choice of two different sizes that are considerably different in length, but there's not much material here to go through. Problem is that would probably contact the axle. That one isn't going to have much of a thread base, but I think that most of the structural strength is coming from here, not from here. I'm going to go ahead and get steering linkages going. So this is my stock crossbar. Now it's time to sort these out. Okay, those two are the same size. One of these is going to be steering, one of these is going to be the Panhard, and this is going to be the connecting link. Now, one thing about these kits, if you are not very familiar with the SCX10s, there are a lot of differences. First off, a lot of these kits have different wheelbases, and there were some differences in the drive shaft connections. For example, the Dingo has a hole drilled all the way through the shaft and a pass-through grub screw pin. Some of the later models have a slice taken off of the shaft and a grub screw that pins that down there, kind of like what you would have on a motor drive shaft. So there are some parts that only fit the other kits that don't fit the Dingo. The Dingo is different only in its wheelbase primarily, and then some generational changes. This is, I believe, their very first of the Axial SCX10 kits. So if you have a Dingo or any of the other SCX10s, you need to kind of take certain, I wouldn't say precautions, but when you are setting up a new set of links, you need to make sure that your lengths are correct. And that is something that you can play with, because you can trim a little bit of plastic off of these connectors to shorten them, or you could add in some spacers to make them longer. So you could conceivably lengthen the wheelbase of the vehicle. You can also shorten it. You could adjust the angle of the axle. There's a lot of things that you can do. So just bear that in mind. If you already know this, then, you know, great. But, you know, some of you may not be familiar with these issues. So I think I'm going to start with the third link and get that orientation going. So now that these shock towers are back on, I can put the shocks back on. Let's start with drive shaft. And again, if you aren't familiar with the SCX10s, there are little marks on their stock drive shafts. Those need to be lined up. Now I can turn this over and reconnect these links. When I took the shocks off, I just put the bolts on so that I wouldn't have to go rummaging around for them. Okay, that is a little bit of a pain there. I am going to see if I can't clean that hole out a little bit. Because that is a real pain in the neck to have to kind of thread that through instead of just having it, there we go, just have it pass through. Does not need to be tight. When you're building kits, and especially disassembling and putting them back together, little things like that, keeping organized, it makes it go faster. You don't have to, make mistakes that eat up time to correct by having to take things apart and put them back together because you put the wrong piece of hardware somewhere. But in general, you just don't have to look as hard for what's what. Everything goes back nice and easy. Okay, now you see this sway back and forth here. That is what the link from here to here prevents. That keeps that from swinging. And the link from here to one of the 2 4-link mount points prevents the axle from doing this. That is the point of the linkages on a Panhard. So I am going to start by eyeing out this, and I'm going to want 2 of these angled pieces. See how they have a slight dog leg in them? And I'm going to want one facing this way at the back end here, and at the other end facing the opposite direction. So what we have here is like a stretched out Z, a little bit of a zigzag there to be able to go from one side of the car to the center. My fingers take enough of a beating in this hobby. If you look at these pieces, you can see that they've got an edge at the top and on the bottom, makes a nice flat spot for mounting. Fortunately, when you're holding onto those and twisting, they can really wreak havoc on your fingertips. It's easy enough just to take a pair of pliers and hold it down while you snug in that grub screw. If you look down the center here, this mount for this 3rd link, this control arm, is off center. So I would have thought by looking at this that they are having that off centered so that this arm could be in the center regardless of which side you put it on. The way they have it set up, it looks like it's mounted on the outside here, far off the center line. And normally I would trust them and do it their way, but see, if you do it on this side, number one, these angled pieces look like they are perfect to the task. Number two, if I do it on this side, the way the directions show, I've got drive shaft. Now, even with the stock setup, there's no conflict with the drive shaft, but it is close. I think I'm going to try doing it the way I think it should be done, and I'll see if I have any problems. I still need to determine whether or not I need to shorten this linkage, because again, because this says it fits the Axial SCX10 does not mean it fits the Dingo SCX10. Fortunately, I have a nice collection of miscellaneous items. I happen to have a threaded control rod similar to what's in the rear here, and it is oh, maybe a 1/4 inch shorter, and that should make up the difference. Something else had come to mind. I have some spacers for my various on-road and off-road race cars. And oops, this is a Losi 1mm spacer for their 1/10 kits. That might be just the ticket to bring this arm out a little bit towards center, close a bit of this gap, narrow the amount of angle, and not to mention making sure that there's no issues with clearance. Just like when I did the 4-link for the rear, since it was not a stock setup, I needed to do a certain amount of tinkering to get things to fit, as far as getting the right control rod length. So I'm not going to tighten that too much right now. I just want to see where I'm at. Okay, if that is centered, that I really don't like those springs. The dual rate thing just doesn't. There's just too much catching on those.